I rise in opposition to this legislation. And I agree with much of what the prior speaker said about the innovation scholarships. I agree in general that we all want innovation. For the reason that I'm opposing SB 103, and it's because this bill, in the end, doesn't really promote innovation. I oppose 103 and its companions partially because they were crafted outside of the Education Policy Committee, introduced on a Monday, heard on a Tuesday and Wednesday, and passed out of the Education Committee on the next day it met, that Friday. Compared to the amount of work that went into other education bills in the committee, some of which have yet to find their way to the floor, but where deliberation and patience have led to strong legislation, this bill's birth came through a poor public process. Mr. President, it's not my intent to use harsh words on this floor, and I haven't most of the session. And I respect the work that goes into bills and crafting legislation. And we did have an opportunity to hear testimony. But at the same time, testifiers were denied an opportunity to bring up the proposed $69 million in education cuts that this bill and its companions were designed to offset, according to comments in a majority press conference when they were introduced that Monday. Nonetheless, despite reeling from the impact of those cuts, people briefly were allowed a chance to focus on this bill, and nearly all testimony was in opposition in the committee I served on and on its day of public hearing in the Finance Committee. Most of that opposition was to the provisions that at first eliminated and now alter the Performance Scholarship Program, and I commend the Finance Committee for recognizing that testimony and adding those provisions into this bill and preserving the best elements of that scholarship. We had heard about the successes of the scholarships and how it has helped students choose to stay in Alaska, how it's encouraged kids to reinvest in Alaska, how it's made a difference. We heard that the scholarship program could be improved, and some of those suggestions are right here before us. But it seems to me that the truth of this legislation is it's not really about the Performance Scholarship Program. And Mr. President, we heard about the importance of innovation and how critical this bill is to that effort. Innovation as an outcome is a buzzword this session that we're all using. But in this bill, $5.8 million in grants for districts fighting to recover 10 times that amount. As I described it in committee, that would lead to a scramble between those who can afford good grant writers and those who can't. Survival of the strongest, those with still some resources left, crawling over those without resources, scrambling against each other in some kind of Hobbesian dilemma, a weird kind of brutishness. This bill isn't about innovation either, not to me. The innovation suggested will create greater gaps in learning, smaller amounts available over time as each year further depletes the fund. And I remind you, $64 million is already designated to come out of this principle by this body and this majority in the operating budget. As one Deputy Commissioner of Education has written me, and may I read, Mr. President?
Go right ahead.
This legislation proposes experimental innovation at the cost of solid innovation. It creates a grants program that isn't nimble and responsive. It will completely deplete a sustainable fund, and in a few years, I am certain the conversation on education will be the same in the Capitol hallway as it is today. And a former commissioner said, it's an exercise, and I quote, an exercise in futility. What a waste. This bill isn't about performance scholarship or about innovation. It's about finding a way to spend the sustainable fund that supports education today. That's what we're voting on today, Mr. President. In Louisiana, former Governor Jindal, bent on retaining his conservative cred, budget-cutting cred, and his ultimately failed run for the presidency, sacrificed every savings and replenishing account in that state to create the appearance of sustainability. In doing so, he sacrificed his state's future. Are we doing the same thing? Are we going down the same path? I don't think we need to. The prior speaker described some of the different choices that have had to be made in this body on budgets, those kinds of things. We can fund education, innovation, and provide support for our students who are seeking higher education. We have better options before us. The other bodies proposed a fiscal plan that does not necessitate the wiping out of this fund or others, and it charts a fiscally sustainable future that offers opportunity for education. This bill really does none of that. Ultimately, this bill is designed to eventually destroy the higher education fund behind the mask of innovation and progressive thought. But, Mr. President, this bill is neither innovation nor progressive. It's public policy that does what our operating budget did. It perpetuates our continued reliance on the back of the poor, the disadvantaged, the young, our rural residents, and the parents of our state to fund our future. It's not about everyone helping out or kicking in. It's about going after education ultimately and the funds we've set aside to support education. Articles that we've described on this floor talk about how almost all the real cuts to this budget have fallen on education. All of them. And that is an attack upon the future of Alaska itself. In the same week in which we send a bill from committee that absolves the oil industry of taxes, we ratchet down harder on education, because that's what this bill ultimately does. We say innovation, we mean depletion. We say rigor, we mean loss of opportunity. One of the senator from District D's constituents wrote to me and referred to this bill and its companions as, quote, the largest single attack on Alaska's school system in state history. I think he was wrong. He was exaggerating. It's close. But the operating budget we passed was an even more massive attack. Together, these actions, this bill and that budget, place us on an even more precarious ground when it comes to our constitutional duty to funding the, and I quote, adequate education identified as our constitutional obligation by Judge Gleason and that I have described in detail on this floor. Mr. President, this bill, of course, is likely to pass, and that's a shame. In another time with a stable and sustainable budget, a fully funded commitment to education, and the full vetting any substantial bill should undergo in this body, I think we would have crafted a meaningful piece of legislation from the pieces of this bill, because I think there's good intent in this bill. Mr. President, we could have crafted legislation that accomplished the goals so eloquently described and supported by the former chair of our Education Committee, my colleague from Palmer, to create a supportive, innovative learning environment for parents, teachers, and students. That is a laudable goal that we all support, and a bill we all could have passed, and we all could have voted for. But this is not that bill. As with the operating budget, I cannot be a party to legislation that purports to help our education system, but in the end damages it. I'll be opposing SB 103, both here and with all my effort, should it come before the other body.